Star Wars Battlefront 2 in the original Battlefront from the early 2000s by Pandemic Studios is some of the most influential games of all time. A lot of people don't know this, of course, but there are many ways that these games influenced modern gaming and modern shooter games. Everything from hero shooters to online shooters to even some ways third-person shooting games. Alright, so we're going to get into 5 different points as to how the classic Battlefronts inspired modern gaming. Star Wars Battlefront was one of the first games to have huge open multiplayer battlefields when it came out and was an instant hit. Now, of course, Battlefront had already existed before this as it came out in 2002. But here's the thing, the games were exclusive to PC at the time and did not come to consoles, and there was no licensed game quite like Battlefront that was also an online shooter, because most licensed games were just crappy platformers at that time, and a lot of Star Wars games were more original content, of course. And this Battlefront game really proved a lot of points. It proved, for one, that console players wanted to have an epic Battlefield-like game with lots of people shooting at each other on console. It proved as well that the consoles can handle this type of game. The PS2 ran it for sakes, right? Because the PS2 was not known to be the best console in the world. And Xbox, of course, had it, but the Xbox was a lot more powerful. And the fact that this game was a huge hit on both was just a big milestone for them. And now the thing is too, is that Battlefield is now more associated with console than it is on PC. More console players play Battlefield than they do on PC nowadays. Of course, it's still big on PC, but not like it used to be. And it's not the PC game like it was when it came out. Battlefront set this trend. Battlefront showed the people and the publishers what they can do and what the people want. It was really awesome for its time, very innovative that way. And you know what? Back then, having this game where you get to shoot all these guys, take place in these huge battles, never mind the fact it was Star Wars, just the fact you can have a game where you're just in these gigantic battles and you really feel like you're a part of it, especially in the first Battlefront, absolutely crazy and mind-blowing for its time. Absolutely. Something that genuinely shocks me that more people do not talk about when talking about this era and this game, as in the two Battlefronts, not just the first one, but also the second one, but especially the first one, is that it was a third-person shooter, and a multiplayer one at that. And never mind the fact that it was like the modern third-person shooter, where, you know, you got like the view over the guy's shoulder and you zoom in and then like it zooms in more over the shoulder, you know, like I don't know how to explain that any better than it is. And a lot of people will say that Resident Evil 4 was the first one that really popularized it, but it's debatable that Battlefront was, because Battlefront was on more consoles, for one, it had a bigger appeal being a Star Wars IP, and two, it came out before Resident Evil 4. It came out in 2004, the first Battlefront. Absolutely crazy to think about. And like it switched from first to third person, which was, I guess, pretty innovative for the time too. Most of us played in third person, let's be quite honest here, even though it is considered a first person shooter, which is really weird. But we all know it as a third person game. And like, you got to think about this at the time. How many games had like a third person view like this game? Most games that were third person, like SOCOM, had that like weird, like third, I don't even know if it's considered third person, because like you're like not even over the shoulder, you're like behind the guy, you know? And that's like just, it's so awkward having that, and like not many games had it. And like this was huge for the time, because we still use these third person shooter mechanics to this very day, the way that this game did. This game was actually like the first one to really popularize it the way that like a modern third person game would like play it, like a Gears of War, for example, or even today with the game like Marvel Rivals, which is in third person, right? Not many games have that third person aspect back then, and a game as big as Battlefront obviously influenced them all a lot more than we realize, because everyone also credits this to Gears of War popularizing in the shooter genre when Battlefront did it first. Battlefront was there before. Two original Battlefront games were online shooters and were damn fun ones at that. And they even had a good amount of fun to be had with the offline aspect. Now, most of us did experience it offline rather than online, because let's be real, internet is not what it is today. And if you had it, it was probably garbage. And if you had good internet, you were very, very lucky to have it, because most of us didn't have it back then. And this was a big deal for its time to have an online shooter also that's a licensed game and on console too, because a lot of the shooters were only on PC, of course, right? This game actually came out the same year as Halo 2, probably the biggest shooter game of the generation for consoles, right? So this game came out in 2004, same year as Halo 2, Battlefront 1, of course. And this was a big deal, because back then, console games were just getting into online. We occasionally had an MMO like Phantasy Star Online. You occasionally had a shooter game like Halo 2. But like before 2004, there wasn't much to work with when it came to online games, and especially ones that were big battlefields as well. And it was so much fun to have this, and like you could not imagine what it was like back then to have a game come out like this for someone who had the online aspects of Xbox Live or PlayStation 2 online. To be able to just go online and play against other people, crazy, absolutely crazy back then. We couldn't imagine it back then. Back then, we imagined getting together and playing games that way, and it was a lot of fun, of course, playing it offline. But the online aspect was amazing. And if you had it on PC too, you were just having a blast. I've had this thought of Star Wars Battlefront being the first true hero shooter when playing Marvel Rivals, and comparing how the two games work, of course. And Battlefront is not a hero shooter, of course not, but like the way it uses class-based systems make it almost feel like a hero shooter. Because if you like play games in the early to mid 2000s, this was unheard of. Most games would be an arena shooter like Halo, where everyone starts off with the same weapon, and you gotta like find the weapons that are good, the power weapons as they would call them, right? And then there's the occasional arcade shooter like Call of Duty back then. But like Call of Duty wasn't that much of an arcade shooter. It was more of an arena shooter back then, of course. And then the only real arcade shooter was like Time Splitters 2, of course. And then like in a game like Counter-Strike, there wasn't a whole lot of variety in comparison to today's market. Because in a game like Counter-Strike, you're kind of just playing the role, but you had the same class, right? With Battlefront, it was huge because you got to play as a class, and when you played that class, you did what that class's role was supposed to be, like how a hero shooter kind of does it. Almost, not quite the same, obviously, right? For example, you're playing as the engineer. You're going to not be, in the front lines killing people. You're going to be repairing vehicles, repairing turrets, healing people up, those kinds of things, right? It's really, really cool to think about. And this was a big deal for its time because it was very dedicated to that. Most games were, again, the arena shooter style. Most games did not have this kind of shooter style. Of course, you didn't really have a role you were going for. You kind of just played the game and then like did the role the way you just kind of wanted to do it if you needed to. It was a very different kind of thing. And another thing too was that a lot of multiplayer games for this time were just tacked on multiplayer experiences. For example, like a Ghost Recon one, or maybe even like Star Fox Assault, for example, or like GoldenEye. That was almost tacked on, but I guess it was also arcadey too. And that's not the whole point. The whole point was that there wasn't a whole lot of games that were like this dedicated game where you are a guy who's getting into class and you're going around fulfilling that. And it's not the first of its kind, of course. There's obviously games that did it before this, but it's one of the most influential because this game was huge when it came out. Star Wars Battlefront is oddly enough one of the first online shooter games to have sprint and a pseudo-advanced movement to it. Here's what I mean in terms of the pseudo movement. The first game has the ducking, prone, dodge rolling, and it's not a huge deal, but it is innovative in a lot of ways. And the second game actually has some of the tightest controls of any online shooter game you will play, even today. Plus, it is one of the first mainstream games to include a sprint feature. And what I mean by mainstream games is like a mainstream shooter game, because of course Mario had it and all that, but anyways, who cares? It was like, it would not be credited to being the game that popularized the mechanic, but when you look back on the online shooter games of this era, tell me how many of them have movement like Battlefront 2. From the sprinting, to the ducking, the dodging, like COD and Halo, for example. Halo doesn't have sprint until later, and that was always controversial. COD didn't get it until COD 3, oddly enough, and the modern quote-unquote feel of COD didn't happen until like 2007 with COD 4, which is just crazy to think about. But yeah, Battlefront 2 was way ahead of its time when it came to the movement. And for an online shooter, You look at games today, and they still use and feel the same way that the two Battlefront games did. These games like established the overall movement and feel of like a lot of modern shooting games in a lot of ways, and it's really mind-blowing to me just how amazing they were. And it really makes you wonder what gaming would be like if we had such an amazing team like the one at Pandemic still around today. These guys are unreal how good they were, how ahead of time they were, and just like the first two Battlefront games prove all this and more. They're just like, it's just insane to think about what a detrimental loss it was to actually lose these guys and what gaming will be like today. That was my list on the top ways that Battlefront influenced modern gaming and still does to this day. And like, you cannot begin to explain just how special these games really are. And like, people talk about like what ifs in gaming, like what if Sonic 06 and Sonic was a bunch of idiots, or Nintendo was bought by Microsoft. But like, imagine what an online game would be like today if we still had the OG Pandemic team around. I couldn't imagine. They would create what would become Overwatch years before Overwatch even came out. You know what I mean? They would have created like that popular hero shooter. Just the way they innovated. Or they would have created that popular game like Battlefield was. They would have done something like that way ahead of all these other games and would have had a huge game franchise on their boots, but they didn't because things just didn't work out. And you know what? That's okay, because we still live in a pretty good time when it comes to that. It's just a shame that we did lose like such a detrimental, amazing studio and Pandemic. They're just so good, and we never had them replaced. Was the thing about it, is we never had a studio truly replace them. These guys were just amazing, and it always sucks. I'll never get over the fact we lost them as a studio. But you know what? Again, we had some good stuff, so we can't complain. So you guys let me know what you thought of the video down below. Tell me if you think there's any more ways that Battlefront influenced modern gaming, and I'll be sure to see you all on the next video!